Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the DriveCon London 2021. Today, my talk is going to be about the new recommended jetpack register for activity API, result API. But first, I'm going to start by introducing myself. So who am I? I am an Android Engineer 3 at Stream Frontdo. I'm also founder of Budgeting Buddy. I'm a current student at Samo Gene and a GDE, and just recently became a GDE. And I volunteer for Women Who Code Mobile. I'm also a Women Tech Makers. Oh, and I wear so many titles, like being a mom and a wife. Sorry. It's still early here because I'm still in the USA. Wish I could be there with you all, but I'm looking forward to attending next time. So what is it? So it took me a bit to wrap my head around this new API, but I can say it's pretty slick, especially when used from the consuming app side. And what a better way to pass data between activities. If you've been building Android applications, you have indeed used setActivityResult in a way or another. Also, setActivityResult itself has been deprecated, hence the new API. So you might be wondering why. So in setting an activity for a result, in this case, an app that has a memory-intensive operation, such as camera usage, it's almost certain that your process and your activity will or might be destroyed due to low memory. For this reason, the ActivityResult API decouples the result callback from the place in your code where you launch the other activity. This is because the result callback needs to be available when your process and activity are recreated. Furthermore, the callback must be unconditionally registered every time your activity is created. Even if the logic of launching the other activity, even if the logic of launching the other activity only happens based upon an user input or other business logic. So I'm going to show you how we used to do it before. So here's a sample of how we did things before. And as we know, passing data and getting getting responses between two activities are the most common things we do during the development phase. Currently, the only way to get responses back from the next activity is through passing an intent and a request code through setActivityResult. And after that, we have to check the request and result code before passing responses on the activity result. Maybe some of you agree that when the app grows, there will be a lot of nested if, and the code will be tightly coupled and more difficult to test. And you can see, I have an arrow there that indicates. Now, in comes the new ways. So one thing that I did during the research when I was doing this is I've read concerns from a post about the new way being unnecessarily complicated compared to the older way. However, what I think, and this is my opinion, it removes the hassle of maintaining request codes and adds testing ability, which I think is something we all love as good developers. Like I mentioned in my previous slide, I do, however, think its main problem is reusability. For instance, again, in my opinion here, activity result callback should be a part of activity result launcher. That's the launch, so that we can reuse it for other purposes. For example, if I needed to check storage permission for multiple action, I could just call a single activity result contract or request permission for all of them. But currently, that's not the case. Now, let me talk about the advantages for a minute. So a question I often see is, what if someone wants to pass intent and request code as parameters on the deprecated method for some reason? So my answer would be normally is, there is no need to pass the request code because you can simply create that launch object for individual calling. So if you want to call two different activities, then you need to create the callback object. And as you can see there, I have it. It reduces the complexity we face when calling an activity from fragment or from another activity, and easily to ask for permission and get callback. I feel like permissions is something we do a lot, and definitely this is going to handle that situation for us. So let's run through a simple project that I did. I mentioned at the beginning that I am a fan of Budgeting Buddy, and I played around with this a bit. And this is how you start, by adding the dependencies. So you need to add those two dependencies. And I'm going to show you how I added it on Budgeting Buddy. So This is a snippet of how it looks on my budgeting buddy post-budget contract. So first you create your result contract by extending an abstract class called ActivityResult Launcher, which has an input and output, the type, with the type of input and output. And then you only need to override two methods, that is create intent and pass intent. And then I'm going to show you another sample of how I do that. So as you can see here in my main activity, I created a private var called registerForActivityResult. I have an arrow showing that. And then you do something with the result. That's what exactly you want to do. So the permissions I've been talking about. So let's see the permissions request. During my reading, I learned that handling of multiple permission is easier with the new API because we are provided with the request permission and request multiple permissions contract. And as you can see here, in this particular code here, where I have request activity for result, and then I go on and call the request permissions on, and then I check is granted, I do, if granted, do action, else I display the outcomes. So another example that I have here too is when I'm requesting multiple permission, and then you can see here, use this where you want. Also, you can call your own var request multiple permission and sit on click listener, and using the var launch, the array of permission like access, find location, Bluetooth, and many more, you can access them anytime you want. I'm going to show one graph credits from Google about the permission. And I want to say, as developers often forget about these nuances when dealing with the runtime permissions. And that is, sorry, if the user has previously rejected our request, it's advisable for further, we explain further why the application needs this permission. And then as you can see, we loop through when rejecting a permission request, we see A to B. We should limit the functionality of the application and consider the case when the user has checked, don't ask again. I remember working at this at work because we do have that setting where if somebody definitely completely decides to say never ask again, they can't use the app at all. So we need to send them back to settings so that they can go and and allow the permissions. So this is where the show request permission rationale methods comes to a rescue. If the method returns true before requesting permission, we should tell the user how the application will use permission. If the permission is not granted and should show request permission rationale returns false, it means that don't ask again option was selected, and we should ask the user to go into settings and grant permissions manually. And here I have a code snippet of how that would work, especially if you have a set of permissions, you can use an array of. And now I'm going to talk about something I worked on at work. I didn't mention this, but we built an SDK, a cool SDK, which uses augmented reality. And we do face challenges from time to time because I build for developers as compared to when I used to build for customers who are just normal people. But now my customers are real developers that really will scrutinize my work if we don't do it nicely. So here is the part where we receive an activity result in a separate class. So I'll speak in this case because I used it recently on our SDK. In our company, we built an SDK that is used by developers, while the component activity and fragment classes implement the activity result caller interface to allow you to use the registerForActivityResult API. You can also receive the activity result in a separate class that does not implement activity result caller by using activity result registry directly. I had so many questions what the key was, and I wanted to dig into that through the documentation, and I still didn't get why we needed a key. But for example, you might want to implement a lifecycle observer that handles registering a contract along with launching the launch itself. It is also important to note when using activity result registry APIs, it is strongly recommended to use the API that takes a lifecycle owner, because the lifecycle owner automatically removes your registered launcher when the lifecycle is destroyed. However, in cases where lifecycle owner is not available, each activity result launcher class allows you to manually call and register as an alternative, which I think is a nice way. Again, as I mentioned, good developers love testing. So I added a bit of a sample code test that I did for one of our apps And by default, as you can see, result activity when you're testing it. So by default, register for activity result automatically uses the activity result registry provided by the activity. It also provides an overload that allows you to pass in your own instance of activity results registry that can be used to test your activity results calls without actually launching another activity. So since we have a sample app that uses that we use to test our SDK, and we use health for dependency injection, I try to check how I can set it up. I can set up the test, and here's a sample of how I did it. And I know maybe somebody might know a better way of how to do it, but this is a simple way that I tried to get around it. But the documentation does have a nice way, but it doesn't show how you would do it with health. So this is a sample. If you're using health in your application, you can use it too. I think to me it was helpful and it served the purpose. So summary. These are things that I've learned. Don't call register activity for result inside the if and when statement. Check resolve activity before calling launch and register your contracts. So let's highlight a few non-obvious points that must be taken into account. Contracts can be registered at any point of activity or fragment lifecycle, but they cannot be launched before going through the created state. A common approach is to register contract as class fields. It is not recommended to call register for activity result inside the if and when statements. And the reason is that while expecting the result, the application process can be destroyed by the system. For example, when launching a heavy camera app, and if you don't re-register the contract when restoring the process, the results will be lost. And if we start an implicit intent and the operating system is not able to find a suitable activity, an exception will be thrown, which is activity not found exception, which is not activity found to handle the intent, will be thrown. And to avoid this situation, you need to check resolve activity with the packet manager before calling the launch, or the get synchronous result method. And yay, finally, the new activity result offers an easier way to do a lot of common tasks, especially request permission, take pictures, and so we don't need to rely on any other third-party libraries anymore. Besides that, it also simplifies the old implementation that might make the code less coupling and improve reusability and easier to test. And one more point is that I found this pretty helpful for us because we are an app that actually uses augmented reality again, and we do a lot of screenshots because we need to take pictures of where we're doing. We use Camera X, we use all Bluetooth, we use so many things in our app. So, and that's where you can find me. And I linked a few of the Stack Overflow posts that I found very helpful, and some Android docs that were pretty helpful too if you need them. And that's it. Thank you very much.